Let's get going. Hi everyone. My name is Neil Simpkins. I am an assistant professor at the University of Washington Bothell, and I'm co-organizing with Chingy Chen for Imagining Trans Futures, which is a cross-disciplinary research group funded by the Simpson Center for Humanities. And we're so excited to have Cassius Adair and Andrea Jenkins here with us today to talk about their work and thinking about the role of public scholarship in trans studies. So I'm going to start today with a little access orienting, a land acknowledgement, and some introductions of our speakers. And I want to give a brief land acknowledgement. So we'd like to acknowledge the Coast Salish people of this land on which we stand, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Squamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. There are two things in line with this land acknowledgement that I'd like to share. So first, if you live in the Seattle area, I always like to share about Real Rent Duwamish, which is a way to pay rent to the Duwamish tribe. And also, you can support the Wattshep Alta Intellectual House on the UW Seattle campus, which is a longhouse style facility that provides multi-service learning and gathering space for Indigenous students, faculty, and staff. And they're currently fundraising to build a teaching and learning center. Okay, so I would like to give a brief introduction to our speakers to get us started. First, I'll introduce Cassius Adair. Cassius Adair is an independent audio producer, writer, and researcher from Virginia and currently an ACLS fellow based at the University of Minnesota. Dr. Adair holds a PhD from the University of Michigan and is an appointed member of the Committee for Contingent Labor in the Profession at the Modern Language Association. His writing appears in American Quarterly, American Literature, Avidly, Nursing Clio, and Trans Studies Quarterly, and also the LA Review of Books, an awesome article about Animorphs and trans community, which is one of my favorites. And he's a co-author of the experimental scholarly book Techno Precarious, which is coming out of MIT Press, or came out in 2020. And he's currently writing a book about trans people and the internet. A super fascinating project. Andrea Jenkins is an internationally recognized writer, performance artist, poet, and trans activist. She's the first African-American openly trans woman elected to office in the United States and is currently the Minneapolis City Council president, also the first person, the first African-American openly trans woman in that role as well. So Jenkins holds a bachelor's degree in human services, a master's degree in community economic development, and an MFA in creative writing. And she's the recipient of many awards, including a Bush Foundation Fellowship. And Andrea is also the author of the poetry collection, The Tea is Not Silent, New and Selected Poems, and contributor to the acclaimed anthologies, Queer Voices, Poetry, Prose, and Pride, A Good Time for the Truth, Race in Minnesota, and Blues Vision, African American Writing from Minnesota. All right, well, we've got our introductions going, and I'm going to turn it over to Cassius and Andrea to get us started for today.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm going to offer more introductory content because you need more wind up to our conversation today. I'm then going to play about 21 minutes of a podcast episode that we made together last year, and then we'll have a facilitated conversation between the two of us with Neil acting as the facilitator. The way I would like to start, sort of similar to Neil's introduction, is to send out in the chat a resource for land acknowledgements here in Minnesota, specifically related to the Twin Cities area. I'm sharing this essay because it talks about land acknowledgements and what they do and also what they don't do. And so I like to share this resource when I begin talks from the Twin Cities here. I will also drop a link into the clip that we're going to play, as well as the transcript. So if you prefer to read along, I will be sharing the text as I play the audio, but I'm going to be scrolling at my pace, and it might be that you want to read on your own screen or want to read at your pace. And so you can follow this link that I just dropped in if you would like to read along with the audio clip I'm about to play. So if there are no immediate sort of questions or access notes, then I'm going to go ahead and play the recording.
It pops in my head. It was a clip of Nina Simone sitting at a table. She said, I never felt liberation, but in this moment, I'm around other Black people. I feel liberated.
That's LaSaya Wade. She's talking to oral historian Merle Beam in fall 2019, and she's talking about freedom.
It's always going to be a bill that needs to be paid. It's always going to be a water bill that's being turned off. It's always going to be a car note that you missed. It's always going to be that particular stress. But I feel liberated when I'm around other Black people. I feel liberated when I'm around other trans people.
From the Tretter Transgender Oral History Project, this is Transcripts, a new podcast series about how trans activists are changing the world.
What do we want?
You want to talk about trans issues, you want to talk about trans rights and gay rights. And it's like, it's okay for you to be kind of like a queer.
Now there are some incredible trans women of color activists up here with me. Yes, let's hear it for them.
The state of transness in America, the state of Blackness in America, the state of sexuality in America, everything that I care about, housing, discrimination, education.
Sharing space, sharing stories, sharing experience. And that is the work. That is the work that I'm so honored to stand here and lift up for you today.
My name is Andrea Jenkins.
And I'm Merle Beam. I'm the one who spoke with LaSaya, who you heard at the top of the show, and all the other voices you'll hear in this episode. I work on an oral history project where I collect stories of trans activists from all over the US.
I actually started that oral history project back in 2015. I wanted to hear the stories of trans people in their own words and preserve those stories for other people to learn from.
And I'm so glad you did, because the stories are amazing. And those stories are especially important right now because so many trans people are dreaming of a new world, one without gender discrimination or racism or economic injustice.
And we're figuring out what exactly it's going to take to get there. We've been asking folks, what are the tools you're using to make change? Who's leading the struggle? And how in the world are people getting enough money to live and do all of this work?
So in this pilot episode, we're going to tackle a question that sounds simple, but is actually really big. Is life actually getting better for trans people?
Like, it's not just LaSaya's vision of liberation, of being around people like her, other Black people, other trans people that got us thinking. It's also what she was saying about her daily struggles.
It's always going to be a bill that needs to be paid. It's always going to be a water bill that's being turned off.
So when I interviewed LaSaya, I asked her, what about the fact that things seem to be getting better for some people?
What's your sense of that paradox that, like, at the same time we have this visibility, there's also been more Black trans women killed last year than I think ever in my lifetime. How do you explain that? What do you think is going on?
We allowed our enemies to know where we're at. We have allowed our enemies to know where we're at.
This answer was so compelling that I wanted to back up and learn more. How did we arrive at a place where some trans people, especially white trans folks, people like me, think of things as getting better, but life is actually getting a lot more dangerous for Black trans women like LaSaya?
To answer that question, we talked to so many different people, and we want you to hear their stories directly from them. You'll hear folks describing the barriers that they face, but you'll also hear what they are doing to change things.
That decision to try to change things, to devote your life to a larger struggle, it isn't always an easy choice. Activism wasn't exactly Lisaiah's plan A. For a long time, she was just trying to live her life.
I was director of communications in Tennessee, Nashville, Tennessee, at Bell South when it was slowly switching over to AT&T.
Down for the price, plus digital satellite TV with more HD channels than cable, all for under $99 a month. Bell South, call today.
Good job after I graduated college. I'm like, oh, I nailed one.
She wasn't out as trans at work.
As a trans feminine person, it's easier to live as a stealth person, and especially trying to live a healthy life or also live a wealthy life. And what I mean by wealthy is going to school, getting a thriving job, not just a surviving job, but a thriving job, a good career.
But about a year into the job, she rolled into work after she had been out the night before at the club.
You know, I'm still young. I'm still vivacious. I wanted to have fun.
They watching me like TV. I'm one of the best, you don't believe me.
So I came back to work that following Monday with my stuff on my desk packed up.
One of Lisaiah's cis gay coworkers had seen her at the club, and from there he figured out she was trans. Then he outed her to the rest of the office.
The coworker that wanted my job told my boss at that time that I was a trans person. And it was multiple layers to that, right? I was a Black person in a high position at a company that is not really known for a Black person to be that high in a position that I was in. And also I was a trans person. And then they fired me for non-disclosure of my transness.
Lisaiah was fired for being Black, trans, and powerful. And there was nothing she could do. She was in Tennessee, where there aren't many protections for workers.
They can fire you because your hair is purple and they don't like the color of your hair. So in the moments, I was depressed. I'm like, what am I gonna do? How dare they treat me this way? I was a good worker. Then I was just like, how can I take my language and my education and take it to the next level for communities, my community that is not seen? So I joined Black Lives Matter. And then ever since then, I took off.
Joining Black Lives Matter was how Lisaiah found activism. And that transformation from being fired to becoming an activist, that's a familiar story for the trans folks we spoke with.
I'm just literally coming to work, doing my job, and I don't know if I'm going to be fired or not.
That's Diamond Styles. By the time she was fired from her job, her life was already shaped by racism and discrimination.
My mother had been caught up in the prison industrial complex. As a Black woman, she was one of those super predators.
We should probably explain super predator for folks who weren't around in 1992.
Okay, yes, super predator refers to a now discredited theory from the 1990s. The idea that some people were just naturally violent and lacked empathy. Most of those so-called super predators were Black.
The concept was made popular to the nation by the Clinton administration. They used that terminology in campaigns, ultimately passing a racist tough-on-crime bill in 1994.
They are not just gangs of kids anymore. They are often the kinds of kids that are called super predators. No conscience, no empathy. We can talk about why they ended up that way, but first we have to bring them to heel, and the president has asked them
That fake science was part of a trend of mass incarceration of Black and brown people. People like Diamond's mom.
And so she got caught up in that, and I got custody of my brother. And so I'm at home, a single trans woman with an 11-year-old.
As a Black trans woman, Diamond knew she had even more stacked against her.
When I went to college, first trans person to go to Jackson State University, I didn't plan to go there. I didn't know what the history was. I was stuck in Walnut Grove, Mississippi with my mom who was going through an addiction. And I wanted to get out of this country rural town because this is not fun for me. And so the only way I could go is to go to college.
But living in a male dorm wasn't safe for Diamond either.
People were trying to throw scalding hot water on me in the dorm, trying to burn me. I'm sitting here, I have no power in this situation. I'm just reacting to everything that's happening to me.
She hoped that leaving college and moving out of a male dorm, things would get better. But
I worked for Hewlett Packard, and when my transness came out, one of my family members worked there, like a distant cousin, and she told people that I was trans.
her coworkers started harassing her.
One of the supervisors lost their keys, and they gave me the keys to give it to the supervisor so they can take pictures of us interacting with each other and make fun of him. I didn't have any political recourse. I didn't have any legal recourse because of the state that I lived in. We didn't have the protection for trans people. And so I was forced into survival sex work at the time. And, you know, it just changed the trajectory of my life.
Sex work is something that some trans women do to make money. But it wasn't that Diamond wanted to. She felt isolated. But then she found something that changed her life. YouTube.
Hey, what's up? This is your girl, Diamond Styles. Hey, what's up? This is your girl, Diamond. How are you? Now, some of you may know me, and I wasn't trying to be an activist, but because of those situations and because of technology, I started to be a YouTuber. They see your personality, your smile, all that good stuff. They see all of that. That's what they are attracted to. And because I was a little bit older in my transition, I was 26 at the time, but I had been living my truth since 13, 14. And so at the time, a lot of people, their videos were about, I was on TV for 3 months. I was on TV for 6 months. These are my surgery results. These are my top surgery results. This is my FFS result. It was more about the physical, but because I had already physically transitioned years ago, my narratives were about just relationships and stories. You have to create your own ideals of beauty, and stick to it. Because if you have your own ideals of beauty and your own ideals of where you should be and what you should look like, nobody can come around and smack it out of your head. And everybody was like, wow, they kind of related to it. So that's how it started. A lot of times people live up to movie stars and Eurocentric ideals of beauty that you never can live up to. You feel what I'm saying? Like 4.5 million views, and it just grew from that. I felt like every time they talked to trans people, all they had to talk about was the bathroom issue. I care about things more than the bathroom issue. So I was like, people started to say I was an activist, and I really wasn't for sure if that had fit, because at the time I was still in sex work. I was doing all the non-respectable stuff. And I was like, I'm not no activist. That's for the goody two-shoes. That's for the goody two-shoes. That's not me.
But the more Diamond worked in activism, the more she realized it actually was her.
And so what this last 5 years has taught me in being in this work is that you have the power to build community to keep you safe. You have the power to build community to give you the support that you need so you can do the things you want to do. And if you build that infrastructure and that family and that community, that can be a part of your support system to be able to fight when you need to fight, give you the power to change your own trajectory in your life. And so that's literally what activism has done for me. It's like, you want to be that structure for somebody else, and you want the people in your life to be that structure for you.
Ricky Mananzala is another person who's been that support structure for others. He was inspired to build community power by watching his mom, an immigrant domestic worker, struggle with xenophobia and racism on the job.
Definitely remember her coming home from work, tired, exhausted, angry, frustrated, and hearing that things just weren't right.
When he got older, his queerness became yet another challenge that his family had to face.
When I was a teenager, I came out as queer, and that was something that was really important to me and part of my identity. And although it was challenging to come to that conclusion, what was more challenging was that my parents didn't accept that, and so I lost their support. And that sent me on a different path. As a teenager, I had to quickly figure out life as a ward of the state, as someone that needed to finish high school and hopefully move on to other ways of taking care of myself. And so that fire in my belly, I think, attached to my personal experience, set me on this path of believing that if there are challenges, not only in my personal life, but in the world, that there are responsibility to challenge them and to make change.
But what does that change look like? When I asked her how things had changed in the last few decades, Lasaya had a pretty frank answer.
It's a lot of assimilating politics. And what I mean by assimilating politics is, as a Black revolutionary, as a Black person that deals with Black politics and Black power and Black liberation, we think that if we want to be a part of society, we're still using our master's tools to be a part of society that deem us not normal.
In the US, being in a quote, normal society means being in white society. A lot of trans people have this idea that if we get more visibility, we'll do better. And some of that has worked for people like me.
But we heard very different stories from the folks working on the front lines of Black and trans people of color-led movements.
You have to understand that visibility does not change the heart and minds of the people. It doesn't give anybody any survival mechanisms. So Pose, amazingly brilliant for sharing narratives and being in people's homes week after week. They're doing an amazing job. We love them.
Pose is an FX show about the African-American and Latinx ballroom scene in the 1980s. It's got trans producers like Janet Mock and Our Lady J, and a lot of people like it, including trans people.
But if I'm still in Texas or Indiana and I'm getting fired and I don't have the legal recourse to protect myself against workforce discrimination, it doesn't matter if everybody's seen us on the TV because I don't have the protections in policy, the normal, typical social safety nets that a cis person has access to that we literally don't have access to. So say you're down on your luck and you're unsheltered, okay? A cis person can go to the shelters in the city. When I was homeless, I couldn't go to the cisgender women's shelter because they're uncomfortable and whatever rules that they have. I couldn't go to the male shelter because that's a liability for them. Like they literally asked me on the phone, can you take your breast off? On the phone, well, if you can't take them off, then you can't come here. Went to the LGBT, went to them and they said, well, our funding only covers people with HIV. Are you positive? No, we can't help you. So the cisgender ones and the LGBT ones couldn't help me. Now, because of the work that we've done, the LGBT one now is open for all. But in the time that I needed it, the normal social safety nets that I could go to, that a cis person could go to, I didn't have access to them, and they weren't safe places for me.
Trying to raise the visibility of criminalization and police brutality and gentrification as an LGBT issue was an uphill battle. To try to get support from our other LGBT movement allies that maybe had more resources or that we thought should be like paying attention to these issues as just as relevant as gay marriage.
Like Diamond, Ricky found that even LGBT organizations weren't much help when he was kicked out of his home.
We have kind of two parallel LGBT movements, one of which at that time was very, very deep in the gay marriage movement. And the other one was the rest of us, which was intersectional justice movements. We didn't necessarily identify with the LGBT movement because it wasn't really speaking to our most immediate needs.
Even in supposedly progressive New York City, mainstream organizations were paying lots of attention to marriage equality and not so much to trans people experiencing hunger or homelessness.
It'll be a statement on racial justice or racial equity. And then when you look at their actual programmatic work, their campaigns and advocacy were largely focused on very, very narrow issues that certainly impacted LGBT people, but those ones that had the least to lose.
That's how Ricky started questioning whether the strategy that mainstream LGBT movements had used to win legal recognition, get some nice looking spokespeople, go on TV, convince straight people that we're just like you, was that really a good idea? Maybe it could actually backfire.
I've heard countless stories about like a trans training happening in a police department and then the police in that department more easily identifying trans people to harass.
That's Dean Spade, founder of the Sylvia Rivera Law Project in New York, an organization that offers legal support to trans and gender nonconforming people. He argues that queer and trans visibility can cover up the fact that inequality is still growing.
Civil rights legislation doesn't really work to resolve systemic harm against hated groups. It hasn't for any of the hated groups that are supposedly covered. Conditions continue to worsen for all of those groups.
In other words, marriage equality and anti-discrimination laws may make it seem like things are better for LGBT people, but they don't make poor people less poor or get prisoners out of prison.
Rents are higher, pollution is worse, schools are worse, people work more hours for less money.
So for Dean, that means that just changing laws isn't the answer. If resources are still being hoarded by some people, then the rest of us are less free, no matter what the law says. Even though the connection and community that Diamond has created through her media presence is incredibly valuable, especially for young people, Diamond pretty much agrees.
Those key bottom line factors to be able to eat, sleep, and chase your dreams, those are the changes that can keep trans women off the streets, in housing, in good health care, not just visibility.
Still, Diamond Styles has hope that legal protections and anti-discrimination laws can improve the lives of people like her.
You get people who are in the trenches and in those back rooms who are putting policies to work that protect us and are not creating this perpetual cycle where we don't have a care.
But Lucia Wade, the former Bell South employee, she says trans people need to work outside the system.
I want to see more of us building our own power instead of trying to be a part of their power. Assimilation ain't gonna do nothing but try to disempower the trans community in a way of, oh, now we're part of society, we need to forget about the movement. And also that's a white lens, right, of assimilating. As a person that is not of white culture or tries to maneuver from white culture, we need to realize assimilation is not healthy or good for the Black body, period. It never was. It means death, automatically. So what does it look like for us to build our own system? What does it look like for us to build our own power? What does it look like for us to build our own methods of funds that we tunnel back into our own community?
What does...
Okay. I have to always cut that kind of quickly just because I want to leave Lucia on the last word there. I'm going to go ahead and end the share at this point. So I'm just going to say like one thing to transition us into Q&A, which is essentially I love to close right at that point because I think the tension between those two theories of change, like the sort of dialogue that Diamond and Lucia are having together at the end of that segment, really underscores a lot of the questions that we are asking throughout this production. So thinking about how do we make change? What modes of making change will really help us? How do we actually communicate about these complex issues in a way that build power, knowing that we have to get people on board and also knowing that some of the people who are going to hear those messages are actually going to be against us. It might actually trigger a type of backlash that we're seeing right now in places like Texas. I'm sure we are all sort of aware of that news if we're tapped into trans politics. So part of why I wanted to end there is so that when we have this discussion, we have in our minds a dialogue around how do we make change? How can media actually help us make change? And what are the drawbacks of relying on media as a theory of change or a system of change? And with that, I'm going to be quiet because I think that Neil's going to take over some of the Q&A from here.
Well, before we jump into that, I wanted to just really acknowledge, man, like all the voices that we heard in that podcast are dear, deep, long-term friends and co-activists of mine, Ricky, Manazella, Lucia Wade, Diamond Styles. I just saw Diamond in December in Washington, D.C. doing some work. Gabriel Foster, who has created one of the most amazing organizations in trans history to date, in my mind, the Trans Justice Funding Project, as well as, and that's saying something, because another person that was on this call, Dean Spade, who is also a dear friend of mine, created the Sylvia Rivera Law Project. And so, yeah, I wanted to acknowledge that, and just, you know, the debate, and this might help in your questioning, Neil. I think the debate, there's clear evidence that organizing and changing policies and changing laws has reaped some progress. And so with that, Neil, I'm gonna turn the microphone over to you for a Q&A.
All right, thanks. Thanks, Andrea. That's such a great point. I'm trying to think about how to weave that in, and I think it'll probably emerge through our conversation. I wanna actually start us off a little bit with some background about y'all's involvement with the Tretter Transgender Oral History Project. And so I'll start with Andrea, actually. I'm wondering if you could take us back to 2015 and describe what made you want to get into public storytelling.
Great question. So 2014, I founded a program at the city of Minneapolis called the Transgender Equity Summit. And I was working as a policy aide at the city of Minneapolis. I created this summit to bring trans community together for a full day summit to learn about city resources, to learn how to advocate against police brutality, how to change policies, you know, how to create safer public spaces, et cetera, et cetera. At that event, which we hosted at the University of Minnesota, there was this job announcement that the U of M was looking for a oral historian to conduct a transgender oral history project. And, you know, I was working for the city of Minneapolis. I was actually, you know, I certainly wasn't wealthy, but I was earning a pretty solid income. And I took a pay cut to go and do this work. I've been a storyteller all my life, Neil, as you noted in your introduction. I'm a poet. Poets are nothing more than storytellers. We just tell stories in little bitty short bursts. But, you know, so that was a part of my impetus. I also wanted a project that wasn't, I wanted to see a project that was not completely laden in a academic heavy weight over its shoulders, so that it could be accessible to the community. And I also wanted to create something that was artistic and beautiful, that represented the full diversity of the trans community, the trans and gender non-conforming community, because I was really adamant that we just not focus on trans identity, but also that we include the voices of gender variant and gender non-conforming people as well. And so, you know, selfishly and don't want to offend anybody on this call, but I didn't want to leave it to some young academic trans person that was going to go out and only interview all white trans people. And so, so that was my impotence for getting involved. And, you know, I just knew from being out for such a long time, over 30 years, that there was this longing in the trans community to have their voices heard, to have their stories documented, to have those stories preserved. But I also knew that getting those stories out of people is going to be tricky. Like, not everybody can just walk up and knock on the door and say, hey, you know, you want to do this interview with me? You know, so I knew that I had that kind of gravitas, for lack of a better word, in the community, as well as the ability to make this something beautiful. And Cass put the link to the project, well, to the podcast, but I also think from the podcast you can get to the project. It is beautiful. There's an online gallery that we created, as well as you can listen to all, I think, 198 stories, 189 unique stories, and some people stories were so powerful we had to interview them twice to make sure that we documented all that they wanted to share. You can watch the video, you can listen to the audio of the video, or you can read the transcripts, whatever modality is most appealing to you. And then we also, like I mentioned, created this online gallery where we have many vignettes of how trans people deal with employment issues, how trans people deal with relationship issues, how does the trans community deal with family, you know, whether they're accepted in their families or rejected by their families. What are those stories like? And I think, you know, I wanted to see a repository of real trans stories because, you know, as we can see in the media, the visibility is happening, and we have, you know, non-trans people playing trans roles. We have non-trans people writing trans shows. And so I wanted this repository of real stories from real people to be accessible, so that, you know, to take away that excuse of those stories don't exist. You know, here they are. I'm really proud to say that this has spurred many, many other trans oral history projects all throughout the country and all throughout the world. And we are starting to document those stories. And even that project itself was extended beyond, you know, my participation there. When I left to run for office, we had created such a successful project that it got funded for a next round. And that's when the podcast and all of those things came to fruition. So kind of a long-winded response, Neil, but that's what got me there.
Thanks so much for sharing that perspective. I really, especially, I am thinking a lot about how so many, this started so many other oral history projects. And also I would note that like a lot of it's such a good model too for what we're thinking about with public scholarship. Like most of the archival work that is happening around trans culture in the US in particular is done either with a public and academic collaboration, or is being done within solely by folks outside of academia. And I think that's really important and telling, and speaks exactly to what you're saying. Like, not only do you want to capture like everyday trans voices, but you don't want to, you know, focus on the experience of white trans guys, which since we're so good at talking about ourselves, as we heard in that slice of the podcast, is I think a really important thing.
I want to be clear, those voices are there, but that's not the only voice you hear.
Yeah. I want to ask a question of sort of, especially, I'm a person who does qualitative interviewing, so I'm always excited to learn, like, how did you, go about reaching out to folks, and what were some of the ways that you were thinking about who you wanted to talk to for the project?
So I honestly, I didn't do a lot of recruiting, Neil. People were, I literally had people calling me saying, Andrea, when are you gonna schedule me for an interview? I did very little recruitment. It was all from my network, my, just years of community engagement and involvement. I was selective in talking to people, and not so much individual people, but I knew we wanted to hear from disabled folks. I knew we wanted to hear from undocumented folks. I knew that we wanted to hear from, people who have experienced incarceration, as well as people who have been successful in academia. I mean, we talked to medical doctors and psychologists, as well as, people like CC McDonald, who was formerly incarcerated, right? So, and there were some key personalities that, I sort of wanted to be sure to include, but it was really kind of a organic process of, I would be out in community and people would come up to me and say, hey, my niece is trans identified, you should talk to her, or, kind of that thing. So it wasn't a all out kind of outreach process. In fact, I felt a little bad and sad because we couldn't interview everybody that wanted to participate in the project. Just didn't have the time and the resources.
Yeah, that can be such a, like, it's so hard when you have to make the decision of who you're going to talk to, I think. Well, I want to ask Cass a question kind of on the more like audio production side. So Cass, from your perspective as an audio producer, can you talk a little bit about what went into making the podcast side of this project?
Sure. So I had the privilege of having incredible material to work with that was collected by Andrea, and in the second phase of the project by Merle Beam. I think differently from other podcast projects where you kind of come up with an argument or you think about your story, and then you go out and get interviews that match the idea in your head of what that story is going to be. So if you're doing journalism, right, you're like, okay, there was a car crash. We got to go to the site of the car crash and we got to interview the people who were there. But we wanted to take a really different approach because this is working from this grassroots groundswell of deep and well-considered stories. And our goal is not to shape those stories to match what we think is going on. Our goal is to bring those stories that are already rich, that already have sort of live contradictions and like complications and differences, and to make those things into a type of narrative that people can ingest and people can circulate. So rather than starting with an idea or an argument, we started with the stories and we built out, like we had huge Google Docs of transcripts of different interviews, and we color coded them to find themes or to find places where they resonated or find places where they conflicted or contradicted each other. And we started from that place. And I think that's part of why this podcast project is so special, because it's so rare that you start with people telling their stories in such an unabashed way. So a lot of the argumentation that you're seeing is coming very organically from the conversations that Andrea is having with activists. It isn't us saying, so what do you really think about, such and such political event? The other thing that I really loved about this project, I was brought in, basically I just pitched, like, does anybody want to make this thing? And it became a collaboration that was, I think, very organic and very much coming out of a deep shared sensibility that these stories do not belong in an academic archive where only scholars can go and get them. And I have a background in radio, in broadcast radio. And the thing about broadcast is that it reaches you whether you're going and looking for it or not. So you turn on the radio and it just comes into your car. You don't have to search, I want to hear stories about trans people. And so there's a ton of people who heard this story that we just put on who did not seek out information about trans people because I had enough connections to put it on the radio. And so there are people in rural Nebraska who turn on their radio station to public radio, and suddenly they're hearing about, Black trans revolutionary thought or whatever, which is not what they thought was going to happen when they drove home from work on NPR at 5 o'clock. So I think it's really rare that you get to tell the stories of people like the activists that Andrea and Merle were interviewing, and do so in a way that kind of sneaks it into the mainstream conversation without dumbing it down. So I wasn't working with a host of a mainstream show who was saying, well, before we put this on the air, you have to explain what transgender means to our audience. And I didn't want to explain what transgender meant because I wanted trans people to not be bored when they're listening to this thing, or to tune out, or to see this isn't for me. I wanted trans people to think, oh, I haven't heard from this person before, or this person's work is really interesting, or like, oh, I knew about that organization, but I didn't know how it came about. I wanted people to be asking different types of questions, whether they're cis people or trans people. And I just figured, let's for once have media that makes cis people have to rush and catch up rather than trans people have to tune out. And I think that was a really important through line of this particular project. And I'll just say a little bit about process. We did a couple things that were different from how you're supposed to do things in journalism. One thing that we did is we let everybody see the scripts. So we pulled out the clips that we thought were interesting and we made a script, and then we sent that script to a bunch of people in the community who were not in the show, who made edits and suggested things and were like, oh, this framing that you've got feels problematic to me, or like, why are you letting this person talk for a long time? That person's not that important. We don't want to hear from him, or just whatever was going on. Like the initial cut had a lot more Dean Spade, and I'm friends with Dean Spade, but people were like, we don't need to hear more of this professor. Let Messiah talk for longer. So we rebalanced it. I mean, there was a lot of process going in that really was community informed. And then we sent that script to the people who were in it. So I like to use the example of like, if I'm interviewing the mayor of Minneapolis, right? And he says whatever he says, I don't then send my story to the mayor of Minneapolis to approve it before it goes out. That's not good journalism, right? Because he would just be like, listen, you've got me and you've got some activists saying I'm bad, and you've got some of my supporters saying I'm good. And I don't want to be in a conversation about all that. I just want you to talk about all the ways that I'm great. I'm not saying he would actually say that. I'm saying that that's why you don't do journalism with political figures, by letting them review your scripts. But for community-based projects, I was not interested in following the rules of journalism. I was interested in following the ethical values of our community itself, which is really predicated on consent, really predicated on knowing what of yourself and your story is going to circulate to some of those like random NPR people that I'm talking about, right? So some of my journalism friends are like, you let them like read your scripts before you put it out? And I'm like, yeah, because if they didn't like it, we would just cut it. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, I'm not out here trying to make something that fits some exact specification. I'm out here trying to represent the narratives that we have and represent the people who are putting their own voices out there. The other thing that we did that I think is really important is that all of the music and the sound design and all of those technical aspects are also done by members of the community. So I worked with a musical director whose job it was to go research and use their networks and talk to people on the phone and all that to find up and coming trans musicians whose music formed the soundscape that you hear throughout the episode. So I don't know that much about music. Like, I just don't, it's not my like training. Like, I'm a literary person. I know how to read books, but I don't like really know how to play any instruments or anything. So I was like, okay, who's the person who knows the most about like trans artists that nobody's really heard of, who would like be excited to be in this project, who would really get it, who would kind of understand what we're trying to do. And can we like make deals with them so that their music gets out? We pay them from our project budget, so we're not just taking their music or whatever. And we like think about weaving a sonic identity for the show that represents transness in another way. So it's not just the stories that you hear, it's also the sound and the relationship between the sound and the story that is very much coming from a community perspective. That's like a long conversation, but yeah, it's totally okay to go to your meeting. Thank you for coming. But yeah, that's like a long sort of background perspective, but I love to talk about the process because this is a show that could not have been made in a sort of traditional media room because there are not enough people with the type of values or the type of workflow and process and frankly funding and support to make something like this. And I'm just really proud that we were able to do something a little bit differently that I think reflected trans community ideals more than other types of pressure.
You know, I would add to that, Cass, that value around sending the scripts and, you know, really getting buy-in from the contributors. You know, we had that very same value in the initial process. Every interview, we sent the full transcripts to the contributors. They had opportunity to review, to change statements if they wanted to withdraw from the project if they thought this didn't really reflect me. We also used the vignette that Cass put up. You know, we used a trans identified videographer to create that work. So it was a full community effort and very, very organic. And then we had an amazing physical exhibition at the end of phase one of the project, which brought out much of the trans sort of artifacts that we have in the archives at the Tretter collection at the University of Minnesota, and coupled them with this digital project that we did. You know, this is one of the first archival projects that is what they call born digital. So everything is digital to start with, you know, no artifacts, no posters, t-shirts, all of that kind of stuff. So, you know, it's kind of breaking new ground in archiving world as well.
Yeah, thanks for I I love thinking about the born digital element of it too. That reminds me of the Digital Transgender Archive as well, which is another kind of effort of, it is coming from an academic, the work of KJ Ross and
Yeah, KJ.
others. Yeah. But it's still intentionally like publicly available and like collating like a lot of like publicly available archival material around different collectives or collections. I know that the Tretter collection is part of that like archive too. That kind
Yeah.
of, yeah, it makes me, this is making me think of a question, especially listening to you all talk about like, you know, things you would do differently from a typical journalistic project, like giving your participants like aspects of editing or thinking about it. It's similar to a lot of like ways that we think about the ethics of qualitative interviewing in academic disciplines too. Which is, this is a roundabout way of me getting to a question I wanted to ask about what you all think of the role of public media and projects like this in the larger universe of trans studies and trans scholarship today.
What do I mean, I think it's positive, personally. You know, it kind of speaks to, you know, what Cassius was describing as, you know, sometimes people just run into this content. They don't have to go searching for it. And, you know, I think that changes people's mindsets. And I would be remiss if I didn't add that, you know, I'm finding out as an out trans elected official that people really do want to learn about trans identity, the trans community. So many people have young people in their families, their children, their grandchildren, etc. And they want to learn. And I think that's why we're seeing this backlash from, you know, in fact, I'm sure it is, because I can tell you from this project, in 25 years, our whole concept of gender is going to be 180 degrees different from what it is today. And that's because so many young people are really questioning the role of gender, the gender assignments that are, you know, sort of dictated at birth. And that's coming out in these classrooms, in these sports leagues and various, you know, and which is why you're seeing this, I think, overreactive backlash. So to answer your question more succinctly, Neil, I think it's important, and I think it is having a positive impact.
Cass, did you want to add? Oh, sorry, I see you unmuted. Okay.
Oh, I was just wondering if you wanted me to, to speak to that as well. I mean,
yeah,
I just, you know, I can echo a lot of that, and I can speak a little bit too to the work that we're doing. You know, trend studies is a really interesting field because, like other academic sites of knowledge, it has an activist history. Like, you know, students demand courses in these topics. Students demand to see themselves in the scholarship or in the classes that they can possibly sign up for at the university level, for example. But it's also true that there aren't that many trans faculty members. the trans faculty members that there are like by and large contingent faculty. And I also don't want to have a world where trans people have to teach trans 101 all the time if that's not what they want to do. If they want to do astrophysics, they should do astrophysics, right? There's lots of places you can learn this information, except like that's not, you know, making trans people teach the same content over and over and over again, and making students have to go to universities and pay for it to get it done. So part of why there's so much regulation around this material in the K through 12 sector is because that's a space where things can be controlled by these states that don't want you to hear this information. But if I put it on the radio and you just happen to be listening to it in the car, that's a little bit different from you can and can't learn this in a classroom, or you have to pay tuition in order to get this information, right? So I think there's something really beautiful about the fact that this material is free. It costs $0. And it'd be really hard. I mean, I guess that the government could come in technically and like ask SoundCloud to remove it from the server or something, but it would be very difficult to make this information no longer available and no longer free to access. So
well, it's actually happening right now in Russia. So
well, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Well,
I don't know
a lot
how
of things,
difficult it is. It could happen.
That's true. You're right. You're right about that.
We must be diligent about democracy, you guys. I'm telling you, fight for democracy.
Yes.
It is not a guarantee. And yeah, we could have all of this gone.
Mm-hmm.
And I think some of these legislators are, I mean, they're clearly supportive of what's going on in Russia. So
it's true.
Sorry, I had to jump on my political band.
No, you're good. I want to hear your perspective too. Maybe I'm a little bit too optimistic to think that corporations are going to hold it down. And I'm not even pro-corporation here. I'm just saying. At any rate, I think that the what is wonderful about doing public scholarship is just you have so much more control over it, and you get to decide what types of gatekeepers there are. You know, we had private funding for this, which helps. But if I want to make something in my basement and put it on SoundCloud, I get to choose to not charge you any tuition for that. And I think that's a really important intervention in a system where knowledge is increasingly a commodity that we have to buy and pay for, right? So I think that I think about making radio as a way of making tuition-free school. And I think that tuition-free school should exist. So I should also keep making radio and keep putting things out there. So on a very material level, what's so exciting about doing public scholarship is that it doesn't give you a degree, but it also doesn't charge you for that degree. And I think that's a good and important thing to be doing in this time.
I just want to add in thinking about this too. I find that this kind of work, it's really making like a lot of the very difficult to understand and access theory of trans studies scholarship like more accessible in a lot of different ways, like not just in terms of like being able to hear it wherever, but being able to understand what people are talking about, in part because of the power of storytelling, but also like it's not in that kind of very highfalutin academic language that is not reflected usually in the community. So, yeah, okay. So I just want to invite folks now to, we've gotten a few questions in. If you did want to put in a question to direct message it to Whitney, I'm going to try to pull together audience questions with the rest of the questions I have for the last part of our talk today. So I feel like we're at a good place to ask this one, and I'm also really interested in it too. One audience member asked, I'd love to hear more about what informed consent looked like in this process, or like how the kind of like documentation and stuff that you did with participants. And I'd be interested to hear like, oh, sorry, I got ahead of myself, but okay, I'd love to hear more about what informed consent looked like for the people as they were being interviewed in terms of how it was going into an academic collection, possibilities for future use and reuse. The question asker noted that Cass, you had started to address this, and they were curious if Andrea had anything to add to that.
There, we use consent forms, which actually that was kind of one of the well, the entire project was challenging, but one of the more challenging parts of the project was developing a consent form with the university legal team. It literally took us 6 months to get that together. But and the reason why is because, as you might imagine, the university wanted to own everything. And my battle was, no, the contributors should have a say of who can access this. Well, not so much who can access it, but who can reuse. So any story that's in the archive, if someone wants to use that story data, if you will, for any sort of commercial or monetary purpose, they have to connect with the authors of the story, and you are the author of your own story. So that would include myself and the participant. You would have to get approval from both. And if it was a commercial endeavor, then the author should be compensated as well. So there's that level of informed consent, and try to be as upfront as possible. The information will live on the University of Minnesota website. One of the unique things about the Tretter collection is that you don't have to be a member to access the archives, which is, in many archival situations, they do memberships and things because they have to survive and they don't have the resources necessarily to be able to do that. So, that was the consent piece that that we had to struggle through, and it was quite a battle, but I think we worked through it and came up with some good solutions that actually, literally do not harm the community. And I would argue that benefits the community as well.
Yeah, I can just say very briefly that even for interviews that had been done much earlier in the project, so interviews that Andrea had done during her time there that were at that point a couple of years old, we went back to those people when we were making the podcast and we're like, okay, you gave this interview a long time ago. You've already signed a consent form that, you understand that it's public, that it's in the archive, but we're also going to put it on the radio. We're going to put it out on the internet. And like, is that okay? There's another layer there. So technically we can use that material because we're making a project with the things that are already in the archive that we're affiliated with. But I believe, and I'm sure Andrea agrees, that you don't just put something out, on the internet representing somebody or put something out over the radio unless they know it's about to happen. So we did another layer of consent at that process as well.
Right. Thanks so much for sharing. I think it's so important for people who on both sides to think about like how you design that kind of really important part of your project. So thanks for sharing all the thought that went into it and the forward thinking that you all did too. I think that's something that especially academics tend to forget, like what is going to happen to the archive post collection. So I want to put here's another great question from our audience. And so this is specifically to Andrea, and Cass, if you have something to say on the tail end, jump in as well. Andrea, do you find it challenging to balance between the importance of keeping identity front and center, given the trans community's unique challenges, and the importance of helping people see beyond identity, given the trans community's shared challenges with other communities? It seems like both approaches are important to make progress, but they can also conflict with one another. So the focus on identity versus seeing beyond identity and thinking intersectionally.
Wow, what a question. You know, one of the most unique experiences that I've had in my quote counsel life, and I've had a lot of unique experiences, but I got an email from a woman. She identified herself as a lesbian. She said she was in a long-term relationship with her lesbian partner, but they never led with, "Hi, I'm a lesbian." And her question to me was, why do you always have to say you're a Black transgender woman? And, you know, my initial response was, thank you for your message. You know, thanks to me, you can actually come out as a lesbian now, right? Like you can say, I'm a lesbian, that's a thing. But beyond that, yes, my identity is 1/4 of my identity as a transgender person is, it's some part of who I am. It is not the full totality of who Andrea Jenkins is. However, you know, and I was thinking about this question as you were talking about, Cass. You know, people may want to teach astrophysics or study. Like, I am a professor. I teach poetry. I just happen to be a transgender Black woman who's teaching poetry. And yes, I do bring a lot of trans poetry into my classroom because I think it's important for people to be exposed to that. But I also bring in Edgar Allan Poe. I also bring in, you know, Maya Angelou, or who I got on my desk right now, Tracy K. Smith. You know, I bring all of these voices into the room because it's important to have, if we're gonna have respect of identity and intersectionality in our culture and society, we need to see those things in action. So to see a Black trans woman as the president of the Minneapolis City Council, clearly all of my policies aren't about Black trans people, right? Otherwise, I would never get elected. But it is a moment of inspiration for young trans people to know that I'm proud of who I am. I'm proud of my identity. I'm not hiding from my identity. So to the questioner, it's both and. You know, it's really important to me that people see me as as a leader, as a policymaker, it's really interesting. I've been, I get interviewed about George Floyd. I get interviewed about public safety, defund the police. I get interviewed about all these things. I've been kind of upset. I'm like, we have all of these trans issues going on around, and nobody asked me about them. Like, why isn't the media, in the local media, asking me about Texas? So clearly I've done a really good job of helping people see beyond my trans identity, I think. But I do think it's really important for us to show up as our full selves, to not have to hide any parts of ourselves. When we're more authentic, we are more respected, and I think we're more capable of accomplishing our goals. Because it takes energy to hide yourself. And that energy could be better spent or better used doing other things. So, but that's a really great question, and I think people struggle with it sometimes.
I don't have more to say. I was just like, Andrea, when you said it takes energy to hide yourself, we should I was just took this deep breath of like, oh yeah, that's true. That is true. It's not passive to not show yourself. It's active to submerge that part of yourself. Or at least sometimes. I think it kind of changes depending on what setting you're in, but it's just a good reminder that we're always kind of regulating disclosure, and it's not just the lack of disclosure that is work, right? It's not just disclosure that is work. It is sometimes the lack of disclosure that is work. So just had to take a deep breath and think about it when you said that.
Yeah, no, it's real.
All right, well, we are about at end of our time today. So I'm gonna kind of blend a couple questions together. But I also just wanted to note there's a super awesome question from the audience about how can we also display and curate the physical and material elements of trans life and not in alongside oral histories and testimony. Such a great question. I wish I wish I could ask you all that. But I wanted to
just
up.
do it. Just do it.
Maybe we can have this last question, and then if folks want to stick around, we can talk about that one too. But I wanted to hear from you all to close. What do you think? What do you want to see, or what do you think about the role of trans storytelling, like what you all have done with this project, in our current political state and where we're at today?
I think, why don't you go, Cass? I feel like I've been talking a lot.
Oh man, I gotta reflect on the whole power of storytelling, I guess. I'll try to do it quickly. I think that, I don't know, I'm working on a different show right now, and the key sort of concept that we keep coming back to is we want to be powerful but not inspirational. And what I mean by that is not that the idea of being inspired is bad, but that there's a tendency, I think, in media about marginalized people to have everything be a story of overcoming. And then there's sort of you climb the mountain, you get to the top of the mountain, and there's this big celebration at the top of the mountain, you did it, and everyone's supposed to feel good about you. And I don't think we're at a place in our political life where the story gets to be, we're coming up the mountaintop and now we've made it. And I think that there was a tendency in mainstream media accounts of transness a couple years ago that was wow, we have arrived, we're here and we're making waves and we're making a difference, and isn't that wonderful? And I think that it was, the transgender tipping point. I
was thinking of that same
exactly. And God bless Laverne Cox.
Laverne Cox. Time
don't-
magazine cover, yes.
Yeah, like she didn't do anything wrong, right? But people out who didn't know us and didn't know our stories had this idea of like, oh, they're at the top, they've made it, they're good. And that story really hurt us. And so it's not that we shouldn't tell stories of triumph or that all our stories need to be about tragedy. It's that there's this framing narrative that mainstream media really wants to tell about marginalized people, which is one of overcoming and success and triumph. And that can be used against us. So I think that one thing I try to do as a media maker is let people talk about where they're at and where they want to go, as opposed to just looking back and saying, here's all the things I overcame and now aren't I great? So that's not about all of stories. It's just about the ways that stories can sometimes, if they become fables, if they become these sort of like reified or ossified or sort of hollowed out narratives of politics, they can limit what we can actually do and what we can see. So I just caution us to have stories that don't follow that kind of script that we see so often, because I think it's a limiting script. But I don't know. I want to hear Andrea's comment more than I want to talk.
No, everything you said, spot on. I think stories are really what pushes and changes societies. If you think about movies, books, novels, those are the things that really shift society. And so we need to be telling the nuanced stories of trans and gender non-conforming lives. Yeah, I mean, the majority of the time when I think about being trans is when somebody like the University of Washington reaches out to me and says, can you come talk about trans? Like, otherwise I'm just like living my life, going to the grocery store, going to get the gas, put the clothes in the dry cleaners, blah, 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 right? But, and that is the reality for many, many, many trans identified people. And yes, there are some people who are getting the crap kicked out of them on the bus, for being trans. And there are young kids in schools that can't play sports. I heard a really heartbreaking story of one of my friends who has a gender nonconforming child. And all last year, that poor baby held her pee every day till she got home because she didn't feel comfortable going to the bathroom. So that's real. But she also has supportive parents that soon as she shared that, they went to the school and said, hey, my child needs to be able to go to the bathroom, make it happen. So, her life is not tragic. It's just life. And we need to tell those stories.
I think that's a really powerful note to end on. So we'll wrap our conversation.